to be here this morning as we continue to work our way through the book of Mark. It's been very interesting, hasn't it, the last while of we've learned Peter's gospel as Mark wrote down Peter's words. And we've had the privilege of seeing what Mark wrote as the Word of God and taking it and applying it to our own lives. And today we're in Mark chapter 11. Now, for the last basically 3 chapters, Jesus and the 12 have been traveling towards Jerusalem. And as they've been traveling 3 times, Jesus has told his disciples that when they get to Jerusalem, he's going to die. And he's even explained to them some of the details of his coming death. And the 12 are still with him, but they're wondering what is going to happen when we get to Jerusalem. And now in our chapter today, Jesus and the 12 finally arrive at the city of Jerusalem. And from now until pretty well the end of the book of Mark, we're looking at 1 week, the last week of Jesus' life. And Mark takes pretty well all 6 chapters to cover that last week, which we're starting to look at today. So obviously Mark thought this was very important. He gave a third of his book to 1 week. So turn to Mark chapter 11 and let's start reading. Now when they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage and Bethany, at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village in front of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find a colt tied on which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' just say, 'The Lord has need of it, and will send it back here immediately.'" And they went away and found a colt tied at the door outside in the street, and they untied it. And some of those standing there said to them, "What are you doing untying the colt?" And they told them what Jesus had said, and they let them go. So as Jesus and the 12 are approaching Jerusalem, Jesus sends 2 of his disciples out on a mission. They're to go to a nearby village, find a colt that's tied up in the street, and bring it to Jesus. And you see that Jesus is carefully planning his entrance into Jerusalem. He leaves nothing to chance. It's likely this was prearranged. He probably knew the owner of the colt, and they had discussed this beforehand. Jesus has been to the Bethany, Jerusalem area many times over the last 3 years. Some of his best friends, Mary and Martha and Lazarus, live in Bethany, so he's been there to visit them. In fact, Mark doesn't tell us, but one of Jesus' last visits to Bethany was when he went there when Lazarus died, and Jesus rose him from the dead. And on one of those earlier visits, he likely spoke to the owner of the colt and arranged things so that that colt would be there, available to him, when he entered Jerusalem. Jesus is leaving nothing to chance, nothing to last minute. He's got everything planned and scheduled ahead of time. And Jesus knows exactly what he's doing. He's being very messianic. He's acting like a king. He conscripts a colt, as would a king, and he says, "The Lord needs it." He conscripts a colt that's never been ridden, an animal that's suitable for a king. And he conscripts a donkey, not a horse. When a king rode a horse, he was coming for war. But when a king rode a donkey, he was coming in peace. And the disciples understand. They take some of their outer garments and put them over the colt as kind of a makeshift saddle, and that was done for kings in the Old Testament. And I think the people also kind of understand what's going on here. They spread garments and branches on the road in front of Jesus, which was something that was also done for kings in the Old Testament. Jesus' actions are very messianic. Okay, verse 7. And they brought the colt to Jesus, threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. And many spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut down from the fields. And those who went before and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." So Jesus mounts the colt, and they head for Jerusalem. And the disciples are right around Jesus, kind of like an honor guard, and they're feeling pretty proud because they're kind of the center of attention along with Jesus. And just think over the past 3 years, they have seen people treat Jesus very poorly. They've seen Jesus despised and rejected. They've seen people accuse Jesus of getting his power from Satan. They've even seen more than once people try to kill Jesus. But today, they see two things that are very different. First of all, they see Jesus' courage and determination, probably more than they've ever seen it before. They've heard Jesus say, I'm going to Jerusalem and I'm going to die. And yet here he is riding into the city in full view of everyone. He's not hiding. He's not sneaking into town. He's riding in on a donkey in the middle of a huge crowd. And then they see Jesus treated as a king. And I don't know if they've ever seen this before. They watch the people welcome Jesus as royalty. And they watch the people welcome him as a conqueror, as they give him the red carpet treatment. And then they hear what the people are saying about Jesus, all those people around him, that massive crowd. First of all, they say Hosanna, which literally means save us. They're crying out to Jesus for help, for him to act like a Messiah and save them. And then they say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And he who comes was one of the terms that was used for Messiah. It was the title, Messiah. They're treating Jesus as if he were their Messiah. And then the people talk about the coming kingdom of our father David. They're expecting Jesus to set up a kingdom, just as had King David many years earlier. The people are excited, and they're wondering what's going to happen. Is Jesus the Messiah, they ask? Will he save us? Will he set up a Davidic kingdom and drive the Romans out of Israel? And remember, the disciples right in the middle of this massive crowd. And you know, sometimes we kind of criticize the disciples and we wonder why they did what they did or why they said what they said. They say some kind of silly things sometimes. But here they are entering Jerusalem with Jesus. And they too are kind of wondering what's going to happen. Will Jesus die like he told us he would? If Jesus is arrested, will we be arrested with him? If Jesus is killed, will we be killed with him? They're full of apprehension. Verse 11, and he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. As suddenly as all the excitement has started, it's done. The enthusiastic crowd vanishes. Jesus is alone with the 12. And now late on Sunday evening, he goes to the temple to check things out. And then, instead of staying in Jerusalem, they head for Bethany to spend time with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Verse 12, on the following day, when they came to Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And the disciples heard it. How many of you are wondering what in the world is going on in these verses? Many Bible scholars and teachers have said that this is one of, if not the hardest section in the Gospels to understand. In fact, one commentator, and his quote is on the screen, there can be no doubt that this, without exception, is the most difficult story in the Gospel narrative. So let's try and figure out what's going on here. Why would Jesus curse a figless fig tree if it wasn't the season for figs? Why would he do that? Now, I grew up on an orchard, so I understand fruit trees. That was my life. And this would be like cursing an apple tree in May, knowing that there are no ripe apples on that tree until September. So what's going on here? It is kind of confusing. Jesus and the 12 are walking from Bethany to Jerusalem, and they see a fig tree in full leaf. Jesus is hungry, so he goes to the fig tree for a snack, but the tree is all leaf, nothing to eat. So Jesus curses the tree. But the confusing part of the story is the time of the year that this is happening. This was spring. And Mark even clarifies this by telling us that this was not the season for figs. Are you puzzled? See a few of you nodding. I was looking at Anne's Bible last week, and one of the things that Anne does when she reads is she does a lot of highlighting and underlining. And in the margin beside this verse, she has a big yellow question mark. How many of you have a question mark right now? Okay, let's think back to apples for a minute, to my area of expertise. Our orchard had literally hundreds of apple trees. An apple tree blooms in the spring after it is already in leaf. So leaves first, then blossoms, and each of those blossoms develops during the summer, and in the fall, it's an apple. But if you tried to eat one of those tiny little green apples in May or early June, it would just taste horrible. You wouldn't do it. We wait until the fall when those apples are big and ripe, and that's when we eat them. But a fig tree is quite different. They are harvested in the fall, but then after the figs are harvested, a fig tree develops little buds that remain on the tree all winter long. And then in the spring, those little buds develop into knobs on the branches, and they're called early figs. And after the early figs develop, then in the fall, the fig tree has regular figs. So it's very different from an apple tree. And while those early figs don't taste as good as the regular ripe figs in the fall, they can be eaten. In fact, by some, they're considered a delicacy. And I read in one place that even today, you can buy those early figs in the markets in Jerusalem. And everybody who knew about fig trees knew that a healthy tree in full leaf would have those little early figs on the branches in the spring, and then it would have regular figs in the fall. So Jesus didn't go to this fig tree looking for regular figs. He went looking for those early figs that would be there in the spring. But what did he find? Nothing but leaves. There was something wrong with this tree. All healthy fruit trees bear fruit. That's the purpose of the tree. Doesn't matter what it looks like. In fact, in our apple orchard, we had some pretty ugly apple trees. But as long as they bore a crop of apples, we didn't care what they looked like. We just wanted that crop of apples in September and October that we could pick. But if there was something wrong with an apple tree, and it didn't give us a good crop of apples in the fall, there was one thing to do. Out came the chainsaw, and we cut that tree down. There was no room in our orchard for an apple tree that wasn't bearing apples. And we cut it into logs, and we used it to heat the house. And it's the same for this fig tree. Jesus approaches the tree for a snack of early figs. But the tree, while in full leaf, was barren. No early figs on the tree. And Jesus is surprised because every fig tree in full leaf was known to have early figs, and then a crop of figs in the fall. And everyone knew that if a fig tree didn't have early figs in the spring, it wouldn't have regular figs in the fall. This was a fruit tree that wasn't fulfilling its purpose. It was not bearing fruit. So Jesus simply said, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." Jesus didn't curse the fig tree out of frustration or out of anger. He cursed it because it wasn't bearing fruit, because it wasn't doing what it was meant to do. It looked great on the outside, but it was sick on the inside at its core. And next Sunday, Matt's going to talk about what Jesus said after they found the dead fig tree. Jesus cursed the tree because while it looked good on the outside, it was sick on the inside, and it wasn't bearing fruit. Okay, verse 15. And they came to Jerusalem. And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations? But you have made it a den of robbers. And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and were seeking a way to destroy him. For they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. Jesus' goal for the day is the temple. He checked it out last night, and now he enters the temple complex with his disciples. Jesus is on a mission. Now, I don't know about you, but when I've thought about the temple, I thought, this kind of nice building on a little hill with a little bit of grass around it, nothing huge or fancy, but just this nice building. And you got to remember, this is the third temple. Solomon built the first one. Under Zerubbabel, you had the second one. And now under Herod, the third temple is being built. And when Jesus is here, that they've already been building this temple for, I think, around 50 years, and they still aren't done. But the way I thought about the temple was so wrong. The temple complex is made up of 4 sections. The first and largest section was called the Court of the Gentiles. And this was the only part of the temple complex where a Gentile was allowed to go. And this section was massive. Now, just hold on to your seats. But this section was as big as 23 Canadian Football League fields. Not counting end zones, but the regular field. Now, I've been to a lot of CFL games in my life, and I always thought that field was pretty big. You have to multiply it by 23 to visualize the size of the court of the Gentiles. Just massive. And then you had the inner court, which was the part that was for Jews only. You had the court of the women, the court of Israel, which was only for circumcised Jewish men, and then you had the Holy of Holies, which was for the priests. And that inner court was about the size of another 2 football fields. Now, my dad's orchard where I grew up was 13 acres. And as kids, we thought it was massive because we spent literally all summer picking fruit. We never had summer holidays. We picked fruit all summer long. The temple complex was almost 3 times as big as my dad's orchard. It's around 37 acres. That's massive. And Jesus and his 12 and the 12 disciples walked into the court of the Gentiles. And in the distance, they could see a wall. And behind that wall was the inner court for Jews only. And on that wall, and we're going to put it on the screen, on that wall were signs. And this is what they said. No foreigner is to go beyond the balustrade and the plaza of the temple zone. Whoever is caught doing so will have himself to blame for his death, which will follow. Pretty severe. And those signs were placed all along that wall. In other words, any Gentile who left the court of the Gentiles and tried to get into the inner court would be killed. Gentiles were not allowed into the inner court of the Jews. Now, as Jesus and his disciples come in, all around them are tables. Probably hundreds of tables in the court of the Gentiles. Some have been set up by merchants who are selling animals, like lambs and pigeons. Others were changing money. Now, why would you have money changers in the temple complex? Well, let me explain. Every Jewish male was required to pay an annual temple tax, which helped to support the operations of the temple. And this tax was equivalent to about 2 days' wages for a laborer. But the catch was that the tax could only be paid in one form of currency. It could only be paid using the temple shekel. No other coin could be used. So you need money changers. Remember, all these pilgrims are coming to Jerusalem because it's Passover. And Passover was the normal time to pay this temple tax. And they couldn't pay it with their foreign coins. So they had to come to these money changers, give them their foreign coins, and the money changers would give them temple shekels, and then they could pay the temple tax. And the exchange rate was around 2/3 of a day's wages. So just to help us picture this, let's say a laborer's wage is $25 an hour. So the temple tax would work out to around $400, and the exchange rate, $150. Just to change your coins from one currency to another, around $150. And every single Jewish adult male was required to pay this tax. Both those living in Jerusalem and all those pilgrims who are coming into town for Passover. At least tens, if not hundreds of thousands of men paying this tax. So if it's hundreds of thousands paying it, and each one of them is paying $150 to exchange the coins, that literally works out to tens of millions of dollars in exchange rate only. This is a massive business that is going on inside the temple court. And then there were the tables that were set up for selling animals. And you remember from your Old Testament reading that only an animal without a blemish could be used for a sacrifice. So picture this. We've got Matt and Lisa, and they're coming into the temple complex, and they've got their lamb with them for the sacrifice. And when they come to the gate, there's a priest there who's inspecting all the animals that come in. And when they come in, he checks out their lamb. Surprise, surprise, he finds a blemish on it. So he takes the lamb away from them because it can't go into the temple complex with a blemish. So now they have to, if they still want to make their sacrifice, they have to come into the temple court, find someone who's selling lambs, and buy a lamb from him so that they can use it as their sacrifice. And again, surprise, surprise, this lamb costs a whole lot more than the lamb that they had just purchased in Jerusalem. In fact, according to one biblical scholar, a single merchant could sell as many as 3,000 lambs in one day in the court of the Gentiles. I mean, we're talking massive business going on in the court of the Gentiles. And then behind Matt and Lisa come Anne and Lyle, and we can't afford a lamb, so we've got a pigeon with us to use for our sacrifice. Same thing happens. A blemish is found on our pigeon, so they take it away from us, and if we want to make our sacrifice, we have to go and buy a pigeon from one of those merchants to use for our sacrifice. Now, there are historical documents about what's happening at this time in the temple, and unfortunately, none of those historical documents talk about the actual cost of a lamb, but they do talk about the cost of a pigeon. If I had purchased my pigeon in the city of Jerusalem, it would have cost me about one day's wage, $200. That's a lot for a pigeon, but I'm using it for sacrifice, so I'll pay the $200. But according to those documents, if I buy a pigeon inside the court of the Gentiles, it's going to cost around 25 days' wages. $5,000 to buy that pigeon inside the court of the Gentiles. Any of you ever gone to a sporting event where the hot dog outside in the street is $2 and inside the stadium is $20 or $25? Same kind of thing. People are coming to the temple to worship, to pray, and to sacrifice. And the Sadducees, who are in charge of the temple complex, were totally and completely swindling the people. The Sadducees were wealthy beyond measure at the expense of devout Jews. And all of this is what Jesus sees as he enters the temple complex. Money changers, animal vendors, who are totally taking advantage of the people and making a massive profit. And back to verse 15 again. Look at Jesus' response. He entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. He overturned the temples of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. Remember, this is Passover week. The temple complex is packed with people, wall-to-wall people throughout the whole place. And Jesus rips the place apart. Merchants are running as their tables go flying through the air. Coins are flying in every direction. Pigeons are flying away because their cages have been broken. Lambs are scampering around because their cages have been broken. People are aghast as they watch the mayhem. Some of them are quietly cheering for Jesus as they watch him attack those who they know are swindling them. And the Sadducees are just furious. All they can think about is lost profit. Jesus is costing them money. And many who knew Jesus as a loving, compassionate man are stunned by his actions. Are there times when it's okay for a Christian to be angry? Yes, there are. It's okay to be angry at sin. I think Jesus did what he did in there for 3 reasons. First of all, he was angry that devout Jews were being exploited by the religious leaders. And then he was angry that a place of prayer and worship and sacrifice had been turned into a commercial venture with one goal: profit for the ruling religious class. And then he was angry because Gentiles were not granted full rights of worship, as were the Jews. It was their worship space that had been turned into a shopping mall. It was Gentiles who were banned from the inner places of worship. And look at verse 16. Jesus would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He even stopped people from carrying things like sacrifices through the court of the Gentiles. Jesus is totally attacking and assaulting the temple system. By shutting down the money changers, he's shutting down the tax that was needed to run the daily operations of the temple. And by shutting down the sale of animals and even stopping people from carrying them, he's shutting down the sacrificial system. Jesus isn't reforming the temple system. He's abolishing it. And look at verse 17. And he was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." Just imagine wrecked vendors' stalls, money scattered on the ground, birds flying away, lambs scampering around, people staring at Jesus, Sadducees standing there, venom in their eyes as they look at Jesus. And then, as a rabbi, Jesus gives the scriptural justification for his actions. He quotes 2 sections from passages in the Old Testament. And many of the pilgrims who were listening knew right away what Jesus was talking about. They knew their scriptures, and they knew what Jesus was saying. First of all, he quotes from Isaiah 56, and see the verses. "And the foreigners," notice the word foreigners, "who joined themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants, everyone who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it and holds fast to my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." Twice in these verses, Isaiah speaks of God's salvation being extended not only to Jews, but also to Gentiles, to both Jew and Gentile. Now, many Jews who were living at the time of Jesus expected a Messiah who would purge the temple, purge Jerusalem, and even purge Israel of all Gentiles. But Jesus is saying exactly the opposite. He's saying God's covenant is not only for the Jew, it's for all people, Jew and Gentile. And God had intended his temple to be a witness to all nations, a gathering place for all who chose to worship him. And then Jesus quotes from Jeremiah 7. It's a fascinating passage. It speaks of God's judgment on the Jewish people when they lived in hypocrisy. And it's a long passage, so I'm not going to read it for time. I'm just going to summarize it so you can skip past those, whoever's on the media. But Jeremiah says to the Jewish people, "You steal, you murder, you commit adultery, you swear falsely, and you make offerings to Baal. And then you come to my temple and you expect me to deliver you while you're living in sin." He tells the people that the temple has become a den or a hiding place for robbers. And Jeremiah ends by saying, because you have done these things, and because you will not listen to me, I will destroy this temple, just as I destroyed the temple at Shiloh. And I will cast you who live in sin out of my sight. And those who heard Jesus say what he said were stunned. They were shocked into silence. They looked again at that sign on the wall, forbidding Gentiles to enter the inner court, as they heard Jesus say, God's covenant, his love, and his mercy are for all people, Jew and Gentile alike. And then they looked up at that beautiful temple structure. It was considered to be one of the most magnificent buildings in the whole Roman Empire, on those beautiful large grounds, built so well, so solid. And they knew what Jesus was saying. He's saying, as a result of disobedience, this temple will be destroyed. And look at what happened in the years to come. Within just a few years, the Christian faith was spreading through the world, and it was accepting both Jew and Gentile as equals in the church of God. And within 40 years of Jesus making this statement, Rome attacked Jerusalem, and the exact place where Jesus was standing, that exact temple, was totally and completely destroyed. Now, Jesus isn't speaking out against devout Jewish worshipers. He's judging the religious leaders and their use of the temple to exploit the Jews. And the religious leaders know exactly what Jesus is saying. Look at verse 18. And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. They saw what Jesus did. They heard what Jesus said. They saw the positive response of the people. They saw that the people were astonished at Jesus' teaching, and they saw their massive income just drifting away. And they didn't like it. And their response, this man must die. You notice as we've been going through this, that Jesus is moving things to a climax. He's acting very intentionally. He could have chosen to avoid the temple that day. He could have chosen to not create that confrontation, but he's creating events, and he's going to continue to do that through the week, that he knows will lead to his soon death. Everything Jesus does in this last week of his life is incredibly intentional. And then verse 19, and when evening came, they went out of the city. Jerusalem isn't a safe place for Jesus to be. So he and his disciples head back out to Bethany to spend time with Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and probably to stay at their home. Okay, I'm going to ask the team to come up, please. And as they come, I want you to just think for a minute about that fig tree. And think about that temple. Outward appearances can be so deceiving, can be so deceptive. That fig tree looked completely healthy. It was in full leaf. I'll just get out of their way. That fig tree looked great. Everything about it looked just right. And the temple, just think of that temple. The temple looked wonderful. A beautiful building. People coming by the thousands, the tens of thousands, to pray and to worship and to sacrifice. But then look at the tree in the temple more closely. The fig tree wasn't bearing fruit. It looked like a good tree, but upon close inspection, it had no fruit. It was sick. This was a fruit tree that wasn't fulfilling its purpose. It wasn't bearing fruit. It wasn't doing what it was meant to do. So Jesus pronounced judgment on the tree. And look at the temple, an amazingly beautiful building. On the outside, it looked just wonderful. It looked incredible. People coming to pray and to worship. Good people. But those who ran the temple, those who were in charge, were treating the temple as a business to make themselves rich. They were abusing devout Jews who came to worship and to pray. The temple was meant to be a beacon of God's covenant to the whole world, to Jews and to Gentiles alike. to be a place where everyone, Jew and Gentile, could gather together to worship God. But the temple wasn't what it was meant to be. Instead of being a gathering place for the nations, a place of worship for the nations, it had become a business enterprise, a shopping mall, earning massive income for the religious leaders. So Jesus pronounced judgment on those religious leaders and on what they were doing. So what does Jesus see when he looks at you? Does he see a tree that looks great from a distance, but upon closer inspection has no fruit? Or does he see the tree that's bearing fruit, that's having an impact on the community around? When he looks at you, what kind of building does he see? Does he see a building that looks beautiful from the distance, but upon closer inspection it's filled with hypocrisy and deceit and greed? Or does he see the place of a sincere, devout worshiper, one who's coming to pray and to worship? We're just going to take a minute of quiet. And while we do, I'm going to ask you to do some introspection. Look at your own heart and say, what kind of a tree am I? Am I one that's barren, or am I one that's bearing fruit? What kind of building am I? Am I one that's filled with hypocrisy, or one that's filled with sincerity? So just take a minute and answer those questions for yourself.